I've had many clients say to me, look, I understand what you're saying from here, but it doesn't feel true from here. For instance, I've had people say, I do rationally believe that I have value, but it doesn't feel like I do. Or I intellectually understand that I don't need to be anxious about X, Y, and Z, but I still am. That disconnect between sort of heart and head, you could say, can be incredibly frustrating and is honestly not addressed in most forms of therapy. That is why I wanted to talk with you today about a form of therapy called Coherence Therapy, because it was specifically designed to work at this deeper level. In other words, at the more subcortical level of the brain, which is primarily where our more emotional truths live. By emotional truth, I don't mean things we think rationally, but rather our implicit, usually unconsciously held beliefs, which honestly tend to impact us even more powerfully than our conscious thoughts do. Someone might, for instance, rationally believe every person is innately worthy of love, but really live from their more gut level knowing that says, I'll only be worthy of love if I'm perfect. Through accessing and updating those deepest level beliefs or felt knowings, coherence therapy is able to begin the process of unlocking the subcortical brain for new learning and growth. Something scientists didn't even think was possible until 20 years ago. When our unconscious beliefs are updated, the kind of change that follows is truly profound. That is why coherence therapy is so transformative and why I'm making a whole video series to cover it, with this introductory video being the first of that series. So let's dive in. I'm trying to fall. If I had to describe coherence therapy in one sentence, it would be a methodology designed to bring our unconscious beliefs into crystal clear, fully conscious awareness so that those old learnings can be transformed in a way that frees us from the suffering they produce. Now, I know there's a lot in that one sentence, but before I repeat it, let me review with you a few concepts that are core to this way of working that will hopefully bring that definition of coherence therapy to life. The first being the very concept of coherence. I want to start with this concept because the idea of coherence is the philosophical and really scientific lens that underlies every part of the work, so much so that is why this therapy is called coherence therapy. So what then is coherence? It is a simple but profound understanding of how the human mind works that suggests that everything we feel or do makes sense or is coherent. Barring some kind of organic issue like a brain injury perhaps, if our mind is producing a state or an impulse to behave in a certain way, it is for good reason. By good reason, I mean that underneath our reactions are things we learned about the nature of reality and how to respond to it that explains why it feels necessary to react in that particular way. Although there are all sorts of things we learn about reality, the ones that perhaps impact our feelings or behaviors the most are learnings around how to stay safe and how to stay loved. Now, this learning is not book learning. When it comes to the things that matter most, our brain prefers to learn through experience. So if we experience something as unsafe, perhaps being the center of attention, or expressing a need, or setting a boundary, or even getting on an elevator, right? If any of those things led us to getting hurt, then the next time that situation comes around, our brain will say, "You're in danger." Not only will it very helpfully inform us of the danger, it will immediately remind us of what behaviors in the past most effectively protected us. Now, to say it will remind us perhaps doesn't capture the urgency here. It's not like the lower brain taps on our shoulder with this conscious articulation of a possible plan based on what worked in the past. No, it looks more like our memory system simply launching us immediately into doing whatever behavior we learned to do, or at least into a state where we suddenly very much want to. To give an example, let's say I'm someone who experienced a lot of neglect when I was young. Maybe I was even left alone as a form of punishment, and it was a very shame-filled, horrible aloneness. So what my brain learned is that aloneness is this unbearable place to be, and really must be avoided at all costs. That would be an emotional learning, right? One held most centrally in our subcortical brain, for instance, in the amygdala. But let's say later, as an adult, I find myself drinking a lot. Now, on the surface, that behavior might seem self-defeating. My conscious brain might even think it's a bad idea and I wish I would stop. However, in truth, my pattern of drinking is perfectly coherent. Why? Because I found that drinking worked to mute the sensation of aloneness, which, remember, for me is utterly threatening, way more so than any dangers that might come with drinking. If you're familiar with IFS, the concept of coherence is indeed similar to the idea that there are no bad parts, which I also made a video about. And I'm so happy to return to this concept again because I believe it is the most powerful, important concept in all of psychology. Bruce Ecker says that when we don't understand why we are doing what we are doing, we are likely to assume that we are either bad, sick, stupid, or crazy. But the truth is, we are none of those things. So even if you don't end up learning coherence therapy, I hope you are able to take in the profound concept of coherence itself, because honestly, if you do, it might change your life and most certainly your clinical work. That being said, of course, the concept of coherence is not the end of the story here. I'd like to say now how it can be used clinically. All right, so to begin, let me just quickly contrast coherence therapy against how therapy is often approached. Most forms of therapy are what Bruce Ecker and his colleagues call counteractive. In other words, they focus on the symptom and trying to change it or counteract it. If there is a behavioral issue, perhaps new behaviors are taught or encouraged. If it's an emotional problem, perhaps new skills around emotional regulation are practiced. If the problem is with irrational thoughts, they might be replaced with rational ones. In other words, the goal is to override the problem pattern and build up a preferred way of being. Coherence therapy takes an opposite approach, one that's called non-counteractive. Instead of trying to fight against the symptom in any way, coherence therapists simply search to reveal the symptom's coherence, why it makes sense based on the underlying emotional learning. Now, while this might seem like a counterintuitive approach to in no way try to change the symptom, I think it can also be rather refreshing for clients. Why? Well, I think many of us are tired of being managed or trying to manage ourselves. So it's nice for once to be not pushed or even pathologized, but rather approached with a deep assumption that whatever pattern we are struggling with, there must be some coherent explanation underneath it. This is important because even just being approached with that kind of respect and curiosity is enough to start to help our deeper mind feel able to, begin opening and offering its perspective on things, especially if asked thoughtful questions specifically aimed at revealing why what we are doing or feeling makes sense. Of course, by make sense, I'm not talking about rational justifications here. I'm talking about how things deeply make sense in ways we are very unlikely to be fully conscious of before coming into therapy. This first phase of inquiry is called the discovery phase in coherence therapy. During the discovery phase, the therapist really tries to slow down and listen in this very careful way. This is not just passive listening as the client tells their story. This is a very focused type of work, but focused in a very particular way where there's a real ear for coherence. Again, instead of just passively listening, the therapist carefully crafts questions, maybe visualizations, designed to allow the coherence of the material to emerge. In other words, to begin hearing from the mind why the symptom is important or makes sense. As the therapist is doing this, they are likely taking a lot of notes, not with their thoughts or interpretations, but rather to capture bits of language or emotional truths as they are emerging so that nothing gets lost. Then, with the help of the client, and perhaps through reading back bits of what they wrote, they work to craft a statement that captures the contents of the emotional learning. In coherence therapy, we actually call that emotional learning the schema. In other words, the specific thing we learn that explains our symptom. For example, if we're working with a client I was mentioning earlier, the schema might be expressed in a statement such as this: I must never feel alone. To feel alone is to fall into a pit of shame and darkness with no escape. If I ever do feel alone, I must immediately take a drink. It is the only way to numb the pain that threatens to swallow me whole. Now, you'll notice that that language is a bit dramatic, but that's because that is how the deeper mind speaks. Bruce Ecker calls this limbic language, and we often listen for and even invite limbic language because it more fully captures the urgency of what is at stake. We want to allow the deeper mind to sort of speak for itself, revealing its own truth in a way that is vivid and immediate and felt. If you're familiar with IFS, the discovery process is very similar to talking with protector parts and asking them things like, what are you afraid would happen if you didn't take that drink? Perhaps the difference is that in coherence work, even more time is spent in this phase really discovering and articulating the emotional learning underneath the symptom with just a great deal of accuracy and detail. In fact, once the schema has been crafted into a statement, the client is given a card with the schema written on it and asked to read that card every other day for the next week. That kind of reviewing of what was discovered moves the process into what's called the integration phase. In other words, it's important to not only have a sort of aha in therapy, but to really integrate that knowing into everyday conscious awareness. It's like moving what was once wired in the unconscious mind so it can now be mapped consciously. Now, there are other reasons to have the person review their emotional knowings as written on the card beyond integration, and one is that in doing so, it makes it more likely that the client will spontaneously notice experiences that disconfirm the schema, the one written on the card. This allows the work to move into the transformation phase, where the emotional knowing might be transformed. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, so let me backtrack. While we are not trying to counteract the schema in any way during the work or suggest from a logical place that it's irrational or should be changed, we do ultimately want to help the brain update its schemas. We want to unlock them for new learning. After all, our schemas may not be crazy, but that doesn't mean they are perfect. Often they're overly black and white. Perhaps they're overly generalized. Sometimes they're based on dangers that already passed, or simply based on a misunderstanding of the sort that children are vulnerable to. There are actually many ways our schemas could use updating, which we will go over in more detail in the next video. For now, let me just say that as soon as the schema has been outlined and fully integrated into awareness, the next step would be to look for evidence that disconfirms the schema in some way. In other words, that sort of proves the schema can't fully be true. Rarely will rational argument work here. So what does work? Well, there are many possible ways to bring to awareness information that might work to disconfirm the schema. But in about half the cases, once the schema is clearly stated, the client immediately has access to the contradictory knowledge. Why? Because our brains all have an innate mismatch detection system. In other words, there is a process within our brain that is constantly checking to see if its assumptions about things are accurate. Now, when our assumptions and schemas are playing out unconsciously, that detection system doesn't scan them for accuracy. In other words, it isn't checking for what neuroscientists call prediction error. This is why old imprints have such an enduring shelf life. But the moment they become conscious, that mechanism is triggered in the brain. It's like as soon as the brain is aware of something, it asks the question, is this really fully true? It's kind of like if you've ever been talking to someone and find yourself saying, well, now that I say that out loud, I'm realizing it doesn't make complete sense. So a good amount of the time, if the written version of the schema is really carefully crafted to most capture what the unconscious mind believes, then simply saying it out loud, what in coherence therapy they call making an overt statement, will work to stimulate other knowings that contradict some aspect of the schema. Now again, this has to be more than an intellectual rebuttal. It has to be a deep knowing that some part of the inner system has that that statement can't fully be true. But how is that possible? We just said our brain fully believes our unconscious schemas. Well, that's true, but because of how the brain is wired, we can have different knowings or beliefs stored in parallel throughout our brain. In other words, one part of us might really believe one truth, and another part know something to the contrary. If we were to use a computer metaphor, we'd say our brain is a parallel processor. Given that that is the case, once the schema is stated, what often naturally happens is that some other knowing gets called forward. Some knowing that we already have that can serve to contradict the schema. Now, that happens at least half the time, and when it doesn't, then the therapist has many other pathways they might follow to awaken contradictory knowings. They might help the person search their memory to see if they've ever had any experience that didn't play out the way the schema would predict. If not, they might help to create a new experience, if need be, perhaps even through the relationship with the therapist. Sometimes even imagery work is used, not of the wishful thinking variety, but for instance, having the adult self go back to the scene where the child took on the unconscious belief to really look at it again with their sort of adult intelligence and perspective, to see if they can really witness a different truth. However it is approached, you may notice that the new or contradictory evidence has to feel real and undeniable. It can't just be a thought or simply coming up with a more rational interpretation. This is where coherence therapy is quite a bit different from CBT. And I just want to say a bit about this difference because when I describe coherence work to people, often they tell me, that sounds like CBT. And I can see why, because there are some similarities. The main similarity is that both models are working to update what you might call faulty cognitions. The difference is while CBT is working with knowings, largely conscious, held in our neocortex, coherence work is focusing more on knowings that are largely held in our subcortical brain. I say largely just because nothing is ever black and white when it comes to the brain. But in that way, coherence work is almost like a depth version of CBT, like CBT for what we used to call the limbic system. So if CBT is up here with conscious thoughts or narratives challenged by rational argument, coherence therapy would be working to uncover the underlying knowings and then challenging those as well, but again with something much deeper. In other words, with vivid evidence or new experiences or through imagery where the brain is fully witnessing a deeper truth. Now, as an aside, I think there are CBT therapists who are finding ways of going a lot deeper. So I don't want to pigeonhole CBT. I think it has the capacity to be approached in a way that is a lot more experiential. However, there is one final core difference between CBT and coherence therapy, and it has to do with what happens next. So if you happen to be a CBT therapist who is exploring how to deepen the work, and you feel like you might actually be accessing core schemas with your client, please listen to this next piece because it is based on some real science as to how to update unconscious beliefs, which is different than changing our thoughts. So to describe that process, let me go back. Here we are. We've discovered the contents of the schema and have collected contradictory knowings or evidence that in some way prove the schema wrong. At this moment, which is perhaps the most important moment of the whole process, the therapist does not simply say, okay, great, so you can just stop believing this thing because can't we both see evidence that this new idea is clearly more true? What they do instead is simply invite the client to hold both the old knowing and information that disconfirms it side by side, not guiding them to prefer one over the other, just simply giving the client time to be aware of them both. Why? Well, it turns out when the brain witnesses two contradictory truths, in other words, it notices, hey, on the one hand, what I predict to be true is X, but what I'm actually seeing evidence of is Y, it puts the neural network that holds the old learning into what neuroscientists call a labile state. In other words, it unlocks the original learning for updating or even dissolution. Now, if you're interested in the science of that, I would recommend watching a different video I made some years ago called Memory Reconsolidation. You know, memory reconsolidation is such a hot topic right now in our field and is actually most closely associated with coherence therapy. But this does not mean that coherence therapy owns memory reconsolidation. Memory reconsolidation is an innate process in the brain, one that can be unlocked through many therapeutic actions. The reason that the term memory consolidation is often associated with coherence therapy is that Bruce Ecker, who co-developed coherence therapy and is really its forefront teacher, was the one to do the pioneering work of fully delving into the new science of memory reconsolidation and exploring its clinical implications. He was probably the primary person to make that link and get us all talking about memory reconsolidation. That being said, it may not surprise you that the coherence methodology does perfectly follow along with sort of the brain's requirements for unlocking memory reconsolidation. So let me repeat those basic requirements. In order to unlock this deepest form of neuroplasticity, the brain must witness two conflicting knowings at the same time. Again, my brain is actively making one prediction while at the same time seeing evidence that that prediction is wrong. In coherence therapy, we call this moment the juxtaposition experience. This moment, where this juxtaposition is being witnessed by our brain, is a powerful, sometimes edgy, disorienting experience, but also very often freeing and incredibly profound. Why? Because in that moment of unlearning, and it's a shift that takes our brain only 2 to 3 seconds to complete, but in that moment, our very reality has changed. This is what we've always traditionally called a therapeutic breakthrough. Not only is a true juxtaposition a very freeing experience, if successful, it should also mean the disappearance of the original symptom. Not just temporarily, but forever after, with no further maintenance required. That's a huge deal and is what Bruce Ecker calls transformational change. Now, at the beginning of this video, I offered a one-sentence definition of coherence therapy, and I'd like to repeat it now in the hopes that after going through all of these core ideas, it will feel much more alive. Earlier, I defined coherence therapy as a methodology designed to bring our unconscious beliefs or schemas into crystal clear, fully conscious awareness so that those old learnings can be transformed in a way that frees us from the suffering they produce. In the next video, I will be taking a closer look at schemas and what they are made of, because understanding their structure helps us know how to work with them clinically. So if you'd like to learn more about this amazing way of working in therapy, please stay with me.
Welcome, friend, come inside.
Thanks so much for watching. If you're enjoying my content and would like to support my efforts to make videos on a more regular basis, I'm excited to announce that I just created a Patreon page, which I will link to below. I'm always learning more than I have time to make polished videos about, so by becoming a patron, you will have access to more informal content, including deep dives into specific topics, as well as more personal reflections. Patrons will also have the chance to join smaller study groups where we can connect and discuss what we've been learning together. If you'd like to be part of our community, please check out my Patreon page. And of course, it always means a lot when you guys are willing to share my videos or subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate y'all's support, so thank you.